de inconveniencias técnicas que hemos tenido hoy. El profesor Dahi va a hacer su exposición en inglés y no tenemos traducción simultánea. Hemos tenido ese inconveniente. Así que pido encarecidas disculpas, no solo por la comprensión, sino porque es un principio del CARI que jamás cede la lengua. Y nuevamente, mil perdones. Bueno, nada, lo lamento, embajador. Profesor, if you don't mind,
Bueno, buenas tardes. Disculpen la tardanza en comenzar. Unos minutos, bueno, siempre un poco de tolerancia. Esta vez la tolerancia no es para los que llegan, sino para los que ya estamos. Hoy tenemos el privilegio de tener con nosotros a un visitante. El profesor Omar Dahi es profesor asociado de Economía en el Hampshire College e investigación del Carnegie Middle East Center. En realidad, él viene de vez en cuando a la Argentina y esperamos que se repita, después de esta oportunidad, se repita varias veces más, porque esperamos contar con su capacidad y sus conocimientos. Él es licenciado en Economía por la California State University y realizó maestría y doctorado en Economía en la Notre Dame University. Es además profesor asociado de Economía en el Hampshire College e investigador del Carnegie Middle East Center, como acabo de decir. Sus temas de interés general son el desarrollo económico, el comercio internacional, con enfoque en la cooperación económica Sur-Sur, y la economía política del Oriente Medio y del África del Norte. El título de la conferencia de él de esta noche suena un poco extraño. Lo pusimos en su momento diciendo la paz en el Medio Oriente después de las revueltas árabes. Está bien, se puede hablar de eso, pero no es el momento precisamente, este no es un momento de mucha paz, que digamos. Así que, teniendo en cuenta esta situación muy especial, le voy a dar la palabra al profesor Dahi ahora, y luego que él termine de exponer, tendremos un periodo de preguntas de ustedes, del público, para que él pueda contestar. De nuevo, espero que puedan entender todo lo que él diga. En general, el idioma, él va a hablar despacito, pronunciando de forma tal que se pueda comprender bien. Así que le dejo la palabra al profesor Omar Dahi. Muchas gracias. Gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to start off by thanking Kari for hosting me. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. I apologize for delivering the speech in English. I wish I could do it in Spanish. Hopefully next time I'm here, my Spanish will be good enough. We hope so. I'd also like to thank the Africa and Middle East group for organizing this, as well as Professor Hachik Dergogassian, who also one of the organizers in this. So thank you all very much, and thanks to everyone else who was involved with putting this together, and mostly thank you all for coming today. The title chosen for this talk was Peace in the Middle East After the Arab Uprisings, and as it was mentioned, it's difficult to speak of the issue of peace at this very moment. And I wanted to start off with 3 news items just from the past weeks as an introduction to what I'd like to speak about. The first headline comes from Israel and Palestine. and that is the ongoing violent confrontation taking place right now. As of yesterday, around 500 Palestinians were killed, and about the most recent news is 20 to 25 or 30 Israelis, estimates vary, have been killed as well. The latest round of fighting started July 6 after the kidnap and murder of 3 Israeli teenagers, for which the Israeli government blamed Hamas and launched a series of raids in the West Bank, arrested many Hamas members. After the killing of some Hamas members, Hamas launched rockets into Israel, and the fighting continued as we see in the news. The second headline comes from Iraq, and it comes from Mosul, the north of Iraq. And the headline says that for the first time in 1,900 years, the city of Mosul has no Christian population. And the Christian population was driven out after the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, ISIS, took over the city and recently ordered the Christians to leave or stay and pay a tax or face death. And they had been going around and painting the houses of Christians. They painted a red mark over them to mark which are the Christians. And after that point, the Christian population left. The third have been killed, or at least these are the estimates. The United Nations, in fact, has decided to stop counting the number of dead in Syria because they said they could not actually get an exact figure. But the estimates are about 160,000. About 7 to 8 million of this 23 million population have been displaced. So between 40 and 50% of the entire population of Syria has been displaced from their homes, and many of them are not able to return and may not ever be able to return. And certainly not immediately, because around 2 million houses have been damaged or entirely destroyed in Syria. I mentioned these 3 news items, these 3 stories, as a way of introduction. And I mentioned them in that order because the first news item of Israel and Palestine is a news item which, unfortunately, we have come to be familiar with in the Middle East. This is the traditional conflict in the Middle East. Usually when we speak about peace in the Middle East, we are referring to peace between Israelis and Palestinians. But I mentioned the other 2 as well, because when we now speak of peace in the Middle East, we have to take into account something else that is much more than only the Israeli-Palestinian crisis. And what I'd like to do for the remainder of the talk is to try and shed some light on how these processes came to be. What are the origins, historically and recently, of how we came to have these processes that manifested themselves in the news items that I mentioned. And I start with Palestine and the role of Palestine and the situation of Palestine in the Middle East, because Palestine is part of what made the Arab region a region. The title of the talk is, after the Arab uprisings, and in the past several decades, there was a regional system, especially in the post-World War II period, a regional system in the Arab world. And this regional system had 3 things that glued it together, even if there were separate states and even if there were many forces dividing those states, but they were integrated in a sort of way. And the cultural glue that kept them together was Arab nationalism. And Arab nationalism was as many of you know, the belief throughout the Middle East, North Africa, and the Arabic-speaking countries that these countries shared a linguistic, cultural, historic commonality. and that this commonality can be a basis for integration, can be a basis for coming together politically, economically, socially. So Arab nationalism was really the cultural force that drove these countries together or to cooperate with one another. This had an economic dimension to it as well, and the economic dimension was a system of exchange between the Arab countries. It wasn't capital flows, but it was labor flows. Many of the highly populated Arab countries like Egypt, like Syria, would send workers to work in the oil-rich countries, the Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and these laborers would send back remittances, which would form a large part of actually the GDP of many of those countries. In addition, the oil-rich countries would send aid and grants to the other Arab countries. And so there was a system of economic exchange that was not trade. The trade exchange was very low, but it was other forms of economic exchange through labor and aid. And there was a political force which glued them together. That was Palestine in many ways. In the sense that the view throughout many in the Arab world was that the establishment of the State of Israel and the dispossession of the Palestinians was a tragedy and was a disaster for all the Arab countries, because it was viewed as a continuation of colonialism. And the State of Israel was viewed by many of the Arab populations and many of the Arab countries as a continuation of colonialism and an alliance with the colonial powers, through its alliance with the colonial powers. And that's why many of them rallied around the cause of the Palestinians as a result of this belief. And so periodically, the Palestinian cause would be, in many ways, a key political rallying cry for many of the Arab populations. Now, of course, not all the countries were committed to this regional system. Not all the countries were committed politically or economically. And certainly not all the countries were committed to the cause of the Palestinians. I'm speaking here of the Arab countries. But in a sense, these forces were very strong, such that all the countries had to respond to them. All the leaderships of the countries had to respond to them in some way or another. And even when you had more conservative or more radical Arab countries, both the conservative and the Arab countries in turn had to respond to this. However, this regional system, that I'm calling it a regional system, started to break down in the 1990s for many reasons. Starting with 1967, which was the 1967 war that was a complete defeat for Egypt and Syria at the hands of Israel. Several other things were happening that were also pushing this to the back, which is that in many ways Saudi Arabia increasingly became more assertive as a counterweight, even though Saudi Arabia was in many ways publicly supportive of Arab nationalism. It saw in Egypt's leadership, to a certain extent, and it saw in the radical ideas of Arab nationalism a threat. And since the 60s and 70s, tried to promote a counterweight to that threat. There were two kinds of threats that Arab nationalism posed from the perspective of Saudi Arabia. The first threat was the ideas of Arab nationalism were more secular and not based on religion, other than a very broad cultural sense, in the sense that there was an Islamic religion, but that was a more cultural influence rather than a strict interpretation or practice. So Arab nationalism was very secular, and the Saudi Arabian state and ideology practiced a very strict form of Islam. The second was in the economic program of Arab nationalism, which was very redistributive, which viewed in its most radical elements that was even promoted by Nasser, the president of Egypt, that all the oil wealth throughout the Arab world belongs to all the Arabs, and therefore the Arab oil-rich countries were in fact entitled to redistribute the oil wealth. So in many ways, this did not sit very easily with Saudi Arabia, and they promoted an alternative to this, a more Islamist alternative to Arab nationalism. Starting in 1962, for example, they established the World Muslim League, and the World Muslim League was explicitly meant to be a counterweight to the more secular Arab nationalist ideals. This process increased the funding and the support for the Islamist push increased with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, whereby Saudi Arabia in many ways was a conduit or was an arming and financing source for many of the Islamic mujahideen which traveled to Afghanistan to fight the Soviet invasion. And therefore these ideas, the more conservative or radical Islamist ideas were being put forward during this period of time, initially as a counterweight for Arab nationalism. So at the cultural level, the Arab nationalist system began to decline. At the economic level, also the system began to decline because most of the oil-rich Arab countries started replacing Arab labor with South Asian labor. If you go to the oil-rich countries, like Dubai, if you go to Dubai, for example, if you go to Qatar, most of the labor that you see is in fact South Asian and not Arab. And in many ways, this was a deliberate policy that was undertaken starting in the 90s, because Arab labor was viewed A, as too expensive, but B, as too politically destabilizing. And you had periods of time where in fact, not only less Arab laborers were admitted to these countries, but in fact sometimes they were expelled. So many Palestinians were expelled from Kuwait after the liberation of Kuwait, for example. So the cultural glue started falling apart, and then the economic glue started falling apart. And eventually the Palestine issue also started becoming less of an issue and the Palestinians started getting less support from these countries. The collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s meant that the more radical Arab nationalist countries, such as Syria, Iraq, Algeria, Libya, they lost their traditional ally. And in many ways, the US was the uncontested power in the region in the 1990s. And the US increasingly put pressure on the many Arab countries to initially drop their hostility to Israel, increasingly put pressure on the Palestinians, and they themselves come to normalize relationships with Israel. Increasingly, they were pushed to take on trade ties. So for example, Jordan, in their free trade agreement with the US, part of the explicit agreement is to increase commercial ties with Israel through economic circuits of exchange. And so the Palestine and the Palestinians felt increasingly isolated. And in the early 1990s, Yasser Arafat, who was the head of the PLO, determined that he had no choice but to come to terms and sign a peace agreement with Israel called the Oslo Accords in 1993, because after the first Intifada from the late 80s, Israel looked to try and come to terms with the increasingly restless Palestinian population in the West Bank and Gaza. And Yasser Arafat signed the Oslo Peace Accords. At that time, the Oslo Accords called for a 5-year transitional period. So by 1998, the idea was that Israel would withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza, and they accepted the creation of the Palestinian Authority, who would undertake the security and who would commit themselves for undertaking the security, preventing Palestinian attacks against Israel. So the idea is that Israel would withdraw in return for peace, land for peace. That was what the peace treaty was called. Until today, of course, as we know, Israel has not withdrawn from the West Bank. And in fact, in many ways, the settlements have in fact increased. The encroachment in many lands, in many territories in the West Bank has increased by Israel. And they have extended control throughout the West Bank through increasingly complicated systems of not just settlements, but road closures, checkpoints, the separation wall, which was built for security reasons, but which encroaches on Palestinian land. Increasingly, life is becoming more and more difficult for the remaining Palestinians. And there, in fact, this has precipitated a process of urbanization, whereby increasingly the Palestinian farmers are unable to actually stay in their lands and in the villages. And most of them are heading to Ramallah, for example, which is the largest Palestinian city. Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005. However, they withdrew from inside the city, but controlled it from every side, except one, which is controlled by Egypt, which is the Rafah border. But other than that, there's almost a total blockade, and since 2007, a total blockade on Gaza, where the basic, even basic nutritional items are denied. Since this period of time, Israel has practiced a policy that can be summarized, I would say, as maximum Palestine, minimum Palestinians. The process is increasingly to try and take de facto control of as much of what is called historic Palestine as possible. And a lot of what is taking place in the last decade of periodic fighting can be understood in that sense. I can talk more about the most recent round of fighting if you wish, but in many ways the process of increasing closures, increasing dispossession of the Palestinians is part of the core fuel for the conflict. However, this is only part of what is taking place, and I'd like to return to this issue, but revisit this issue after I look at the other factors that I mentioned. And one of the things that I was mentioning was the increasing assertiveness of Saudi Arabia as a counterweight initially to Egypt, and its, in many ways, support of an alternative ideological project to Arab nationalism. This process took on a very different shape after 1979 with the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And after 1979, Saudi Arabia came to view Iran as a danger in many ways, in the same way that it viewed Arab nationalism as a danger. And in many ways it was even more, because the Islamic Revolution in Iran was not secular, it was explicitly a religious-oriented system. And the religious fervor and the size of Iran was trouble for Saudi Arabia, because it presented an alternative leadership role in the region that was explicitly religious. And that troubled Saudi Arabia, I would say. Not to mention the fact that Iran was accused by Saudi Arabia of trying to export the revolution, of trying to radicalize the Shia populations that are outside Iran. And by historical accident, the majority of the Shia population in Saudi Arabia is located where the biggest oil fields are. And so there's always this possible threat, this possible idea that Iran might radicalize the local Shia population and cause trouble, and that their allegiances are more to Iran than to the domestic population. So starting in the late 80s, the counterweight to secular Arab nationalism was shifted to a Sunni Shia battle. It was no longer denouncing the secular Arab nationalists. It was increasingly denouncing the Shia population as apostates or non-Muslims or people who are in many ways un-Islamic. That was a lot of the propaganda that was being put forth at that time. Now, it's important for me to talk a little bit about the Syrian uprising and some of the details of this Syrian uprising and the complexity, to shed light on how the region is facing, as I mentioned in the beginning, a crisis which is unlike the traditional crises that we've faced before, and how increasingly attaining peace is something that is much more complex than it was before. The Syrian uprising, in many ways, which started in March 2011, was fueled by some of the same drivers which fueled all the other Arab uprisings. The same as Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, Libya, which is fundamentally dissatisfaction with decades of authoritarian rule. And Syria in particular was a country which was, I would say, the most advanced, I don't know if that's the right expression, but was the most advanced in its denial of basic civil liberties and political freedoms. The Syrian current regime under Bashar al-Assad was taken over from the father, Hafiz al-Assad, who came to rule in 1970. Bashar al-Assad came to rule in 2000. And in many ways, the authoritarian rule of his father were continued. Some of the most severe restrictions were relaxed, but still there was a ban on any independent organizing, any independent political parties, a criminalization of dissent in many ways. But add on to that, in the 2000s, there were increasingly, as in many of the Arab states, high levels of corruption and economic inequality. The best way to put it is that the levels of elite capture of the economy went to unprecedented levels. For example, a former Ministry of Economic Planning, or people who were involved with economic planning in Syria, did a study and found that in the decade of rule under Bashar al-Assad, 50% of every single government contract issued by the Syrian government went to 5 people only. And these 5 people were the business partners of the president and the cousin of the president, whose name is Rami Makhlouf, who's a very powerful person. At any rate, the initial impetus for the uprising was a protest against authoritarianism and against corruption and economic marginalization or economic exclusion. However, over the first year, and by March 2012, the uprising had been violently suppressed by the government, but something else took place of the protest movement. And what took place of the protest movement was a proxy war between, largely, I would say, Saudi Arabia and Iran. But not just Saudi Arabia. Qatar and Turkey were involved as well. So at the start of the Syrian uprising, the main allies of the Syrian government were Iran, and we've seen Russia and China emerge as allies, but mainly Russia, in addition to Iran, supporting the Syrian government. From the perspective of Iran, the Syrian uprising threatened to remove its main ally in the region. And since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Syria had been Iran's main ally. And Iran views itself as being under siege, as being under sanctions. It's already under sanctions. It views itself as being under siege, under threat of perhaps military action for its nuclear program. So Iran saw, from their perspective, that there was an attempt by its opponents, or specifically by the Gulf countries, to insert a system of rule in Syria that would then be used to further encircle Iran. And so, from the very beginning, their commitment to the Syrian regime was as a result of this, to prevent this thing from happening. At the same time, increasingly, the Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and many sources from inside Kuwait and the Emirates were funding more Islamist, Sunni Islamist groups who were in many ways establishing a rhetoric that was quite sectarian. And in many ways, they were denouncing the government not due to its authoritarianism, not due to its economic program, but were denouncing the government as as Shia, as Alawites. The government of Syria, the Assad regime, comes from a minoritarian Alawite population. And so the battle inside Syria became a sectarian war, where the government, supported by Iran and supported by Hezbollah, were fighting militias that were funded and in many ways armed by many sources inside the Arabian Gulf. And Turkey, who also took a stance against the Syrian government, was a main conduit for a lot of these fighters to come through to Syria. And so immediately by March 2012, the Syrian conflict had become a regional proxy war. Now, the position of the big powers is really interesting and adds another level of complexity to this issue, which is that Europe and the US had supported the Syrian opposition and continue to support the Syrian opposition, with, on the other hand, Russia supporting the Syrian government. However, by June of 2012, Russia and the US had come to an agreement. And the agreement was now called Geneva I. So by 2012, the US and Russia had laid out the basic parameters of an agreement, where they did not want the total collapse of the Syrian government, the Syrian regime, that there would be an attempt to preserve the institutions of the Syrian state. But beyond that, there would be, the agreement would be through a peace process. Now, what that meant was that there was pressure from the US primarily on the Gulf to mitigate the flow of weapons to the rebels. Essentially, what this agreement did is that it set up the possibilities for an endless civil war. The US and its allies were arming the Syrian rebels just enough that they would continue to do damage to the Syrian government. And Iran and Hezbollah were supporting the Syrian government just enough that they would not collapse. And increasingly, what we've seen is that the Syrian government has been able to turn the tide of the war and to push back a lot of the rebel groups. But meanwhile, the biggest process that was occurring was the fragmentation of many of these rebel groups, because a lot of the sources of funding were not unified. So increasingly, we saw many groups begin to emerge, at least 80 main groups were mentioned last year. And throughout this period, one group was able to consolidate power. Essentially, the rise of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria was the success of one of the many militias in being able to consolidate all the other militias into one. And they did it as a result of their ability to administer the areas that they're under. The plan of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria was to go into territory that had been evacuated by the Syrian government and consolidate their rule there rather than go and fight the Syrian government, essentially. So they were planning since 2013, increasingly, towards the end of 2013, to establish a state. And the term, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, is very literal. They have administrative districts, they have systems of control, they have systems of accountability, they have a judicial system, and so forth. And so they're very serious about attempting to establish the state. The takeover of Mosul gave them a huge source of funds. And in fact, it's estimated that their wealth is about $2 billion. So they have quite a capability. At any rate, what this means is that there are new actors in the Middle East. These actors do receive some funding, but increasingly they're very independent. So recently, for example, Saudi Arabia mentioned that they put all these groups on the terror list, that they're on, they consider them terrorists, and they are fighting them as well. That is a good step, but at the same time, many of these groups are now independent actors on their own, such as the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. So I'm just going to say a few words in conclusion and open it up for questions and discussion. It's very difficult for me as a Syrian, as someone who was born and raised in Syria, to speak of the idea of peace when I see the tragic consequences that have happened to Syria over the last few years, the tragic results. In many ways, the Syria that I grew up in is gone forever. It's irretrievably lost. And there is increasing evidence that Syria itself might become partitioned in some way. It's already de facto partitioned. And I hope it won't be, but in many ways, it's already in the process of happening. I think the issue of, as much of a luxury as it sounds right now, pushing for countries based on citizenship, pushing for countries that respect human rights, pushing for countries that fundamentally strive for equality before the law, is still the project for Arabs who are interested in a positive future. Many of these forces animated the Arab uprisings, and now they've become a distant memory, but they have no other choice. In terms of the other conflicts, I think many Arabs feel that they are out of the hands of the Arabs. Many Syrians believe, many Palestinians, of course, have believed that their future is out of their control, that it has become hostage to the larger powers. And I think as long as we don't have a push specifically on the US, on the one hand, when it comes to Israel and Palestine, but also on the regional powers like Saudi Arabia, Iran, as long as there is no comprehensive settlement in the Middle East, which respects the interests of all the countries, not one country over another, but all the countries in the region, the conflict is likely to continue. As long as there's an attempt to completely deny, for example, the the basic rights, let's say, of Iran, or as long as the Palestinian question remains unsolved, the right of self-determination and the issue of the Palestinian state, as long as these issues continue unresolved, the issue will, the violence will continue, the problems will continue. And I think what is ultimately needed is a comprehensive regional peace conference that addresses not just the Israeli-Arab issue, but also the other rivalries that I mentioned, specifically the Saudi Arabian and Iranian rivalry, which I think is the other biggest source. Thank you.
Gracias, profesor Dahi. Bueno, creo que el planteo que acaba de hacer el profesor a mí me pareció bastante pesimista, no sé ustedes. Tampoco da mucho para otra cosa, por las cosas que sabemos cada uno de los días, especialmente estos últimos pocos días, pero incluso antes. De todas maneras, dejó algunos interrogantes que yo estaba anotando, que si no lo preguntan ustedes, lo voy a terminar preguntando yo. Así que espero que me adivinen y que hagan las mismas preguntas que haría yo si ustedes no las hacen. Vamos a hacer así. Como moderador me caracterizo por ser un poco duro. Quiere decir, no declaraciones, sino preguntas. Les ruego por favor, porque es la mejor manera de tratarnos todos. Más que una exposición de quienes hagan las preguntas, preferiría que hicieran la pregunta lo más sintética y directa que les pueda salir. Muchas gracias.
En castellano, aclarando.
Ah, sí, es una buena aclaración. Pueden hacer la pregunta en castellano, le acabo de preguntar al profesor Dahi, y él va a hacer su esfuerzo por entender qué es lo que ustedes preguntan, si lo hacen en castellano. ¿Ok? Un momentito. Enrique Pareja.
Professor Dahi, thank you very much for your excellent exposition. I would like to ask you for your views about what was called Arab initiative, the Saudi initiative, made in 2007 and reiterated some years after that, concerning the normalization of relationship between Israel and the rest of the, I would say, Arab region.
One by one, yes, one by one.
Thank you very much. So the Arab Initiative, in fact, it was in 2007. Originally, it was actually presented in 1984, the first time, and remains the official position of the Arab League as a solution to the Middle East crisis. The position, in many ways, is based on Security Council 242 and calls for a two-state solution. The establishment of Palestinian state in West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, and a settlement of the refugee issue without specifying what it would be, but in some way, in return for full normalization and peace. And in many ways, this initiative has been the consensus internationally in many ways, in the sense that most of the countries of the world have supported some version of this initiative or another. I think it would be a very positive step to solving the Arab-Israeli and specifically the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I think it would need to be made more precise on the question of the borders and it would have to be made more specific on the question of the refugees, the fate of the refugees. I think it remains the most realistic plan. There are many in the Palestinian camp who oppose it because they think it doesn't go far enough, and of course there are many others who oppose it as well for other reasons. But I would think that this would be the main issue on the table, and it is something that should be taken seriously. Israel has not accepted the plan.
Hola. ¿Está partido Irak de facto también? Is Iraq partition as de facto also?
Yes, Iraq is partitioned at this point de facto into 3 territories, in fact. One territory that is controlled by the government of Iraq. Another territory is called the Kurdish Regional Authority. It's not an official partition in many ways. It's an autonomous zone within Iraq, and there are in the constitution specific ways in which that govern the relationship between the central government and the Kurdish region. However, increasingly, the Kurdish Regional Authority operates as its own state. So, as one simple example, they have completely different ways in which they're treating the Syrian refugees. There was large parts of Syrian refugees who are crossing to Iraq. Most of them, 97%, are in the Kurdish region. But the Kurdish Regional Authority kept its borders open for the refugees when the government of Iraq closed them. They have a completely different system of servicing the refugees, and many other ways as well. Now, the latest controversy there was the takeover of the de facto takeover of some oil fields in Kirkuk by the Kurdish authority that was contested by the central government in Iraq. But anyway, there is the Kurdish region, the government of Iraq, and now the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, which is similar to actually what happens in Syria, which is the Syrian government, a Kurdish region, which does not have any formal status with this, no agreement with the Syrian government, but also a third region that's outside the government and is outside the Kurdish control, which is mainly controlled by the Islamic State, at least for the time period, but also includes other areas where other militias and armed groups have control.
Profesor Rivas, por favor.
Sorry, I have some questions. The first one is, do you think that there is any possibility that the Arabs would separate religion from the state? The second one is, what is the difference between Shiitas and Sunnitas? Does that have any political problem inside the city? And the third one, do you think that to some extent Turkey have overcome that problem? Now it's the difference. And the fourth one, and that's the last one, what do you think that should be the policy of the United States with the Middle East? What do you think that is wrong or right?
Me olvidé de decir, gracias, profesor. Contamos las tres como si fueran una sola, pero me olvidé de decir que una sola pregunta por persona, si no, esto se va a alargar de nosotros. De todas maneras, y él va a contestar si puede las tres.
I'll try my best. Thank you. In terms of religion from the state, I would say, even though the apparent no religious figure that can dare question the military dictator. If they dared question the military dictator, they would be, not good things would happen. But we don't have that traditional influence in the same way, let's say historically, there was a struggle in Europe in the influence of religion over the state. Of course, that doesn't mean that there isn't an issue with religious extremism, that doesn't mean that in many ways this process has also created a distorted sense of religious movements in the Middle East, and these things are important issues. But I would highlight the problem, the core issue, as military versus civilian rule, and it is a big problem. It doesn't mean that this is going to solve, once it happens, the issue of religion. And Egypt was an example of that, because in Egypt, really, you had what were the freest and fairest elections in the history of Egypt. And Muhammad Morsi won, the Muslim Brotherhood. And even though many people don't like the Muslim Brotherhood and many people criticize their behavior once they were in power, which I do as well, but in many ways, this was civilian rule through democratic and free elections, but they were overthrown within a year by the military. And now you have a regression back, in my opinion, to military dictatorship over politics. So I think that has been a core issue rather than a problem of religious rule over the state. Of course, there are exceptions to this, and some of the exceptions I've been talking about, which is Saudi Arabia, where you have very much the influence of religion and religious doctrine. But I would say that a lot of the problems, including the Sunni-Shia divide, have been instrumentalized by countries for political purposes. This doesn't mean that these attitudes do not exist at the popular level. But historically, before the 1970s, it wasn't not even an issue. The Sunni-Shia problem, which now marks every analysis of the Middle East, was not considered even an issue. It was the secularists versus the Islamists. It was the Arab nationalism versus Islamism. It became an issue after the Islamic Revolution. And so I see many of these issues at their core political problems rather than religious problems. I'm not sure what you meant by the issue of Turkey, but in terms of policy of the US, I think I included some of that in my remarks. There has to be a push for the US over its allies, and these allies include Israel and the Gulf countries, to address some of the issues that I mentioned in a serious manner.
Profesor Gachik de Rugashan.
Sí, gracias, embajador. Con su permiso quisiera no preguntar, sino polemizar en el sentido. There was a kind of mistake that they wanted, and it ended up with the Sykes Agreement, and Arab nationalism had to adapt to the territorial state in the Middle East. So whatever happened after that was really the expression of deeper, if you want, cultural identity, loyalties, subnational, if you want, that were expressed through the Arab nationalism. Even if you take political parties like the Banks or Nasserism, we know that different communities, different sects, used Arab nationalism. This doesn't mean that they were not sincere believers and leaders, but they used Arab nationalism in order to preserve their own survival. And there are some regimes, but also Saddam Hussein are the best examples of that manipulation. This leads to the second point. You downplay the Sunni-Shia differences. I think that it is really much more important than all the socio-economic motivation of the uprisings. We know that there is no solution to the Shia and Sunni problem unless you have a sort of fatigue, sort of awareness that where is this leading, because theologically speaking, there is no way of coming into a consensus who will lead the Ummah after the Prophet. Which means that we have to think the Middle East in terms of the Shia and Sunni divide. Now go back to December of 2004, in the wake of the Iraqi elections, in the US politics in Iraq. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your points. They're fair points. I take them as you stated them. I just want to mention one thing which also adds even more complexity to what you just said, that it's not just about Sunni Shia, because within Sunni Islam, you also have rivalries. For example, Saudi Arabia does not accept the Muslim Brotherhood, which is why they supported the coup against Morsi. There's a Qatar-Saudi rivalry, and there's a Saudi-Turkish rivalry. So I think, I take your point, I won't challenge your point. I think we are going through a historical time period where the Sunni Shia is the most prominent apparent cleavage, but within 5 years it might be something else entirely different. It might be a Sunni-Sunni cleavage. But I'll just stop there because it's a broader point. Maybe later we'll fight over it.
Okay. Bueno, dado que se nos acerca el fin, vamos a hacer así. Hacer la primera pregunta ahora a cargo del embajador Barbosa, después el embajador Hugo Marcó y después el profesor Realizó Campo. 3 juntas que va a contestar después. La última. Ya tengo que cerrar. Bueno, acá me han corregido. Lo salvó la juventud. Embajador.
Thank you very much, Professor Dahi, for your expose. My question is perhaps not a very long one, or perhaps it is too long one. We are, some of us, or the West in general, seem somewhat alarmed at the expansion of this movement of the Islamic Iraq and Sham state. But I wonder that leaving a lot of considerations aside, that isn't it a more logical sort of motivation, or sort of enterprise to join these 2 states rather than continue with the Sykes-Picot partition, which was rather in the convenience of Britain and France, any future? Thank you.
El embajador Hugo Marcó.
Professor, I'm in a way a little bit what Ambassador Barbosa has said, but I think the region is already divided. And that what you suggested at the end, that was sort of a meeting to find a solution to the thing, is out of reality. What I really think, in a way, you didn't mention much about the interest of Israel on this question, in the regional question. Because I think that the change of position of the United States, besides the problem of the Sunni, of this terrorist group that is taking more than 30% of the Syrian territory, is that they prefer to have Bashar al-Assad, that they already know him and his father before, than to play with somebody that comes and nobody knows what is going to happen. And for the security of Israel, besides the problem they have now, I think it's the best that could happen. So is it not the interest of Israel playing a little bit in this question that al-Assad has getting, I would say, stronger, even though Turkey has received 1 million refugees and is taking a position more and more separated from the Israeli one, changing the policy they had for more than 20 or 30 years.
These 2 questions and then another 2. Vamos a hacer así ahora. Como las dos preguntas son tensas y necesitan una contestación de algún minuto, a contestar ahora a la de los dos embajadores José y Marco, y después sigo con el doctor Realizó y con el embajador Friedman. Y finalmente,
I think, Ambassador, you're, in many ways, yes, it is logical. The problem is, if we go back to the Sykes-Picot borders, the problem was not just who imposed the borders. The problem was, what are these borders? And that they were imposed without a process of national consensus. And something similar is happening now. The Islamic State, it calls itself an Islamic State, but it practices a version of Islam that many Muslims don't accept. It is imposed in a way that has led, as I mentioned, as I started off with mass displacement of the population. In fact, even before the Christians, the last remaining Christians left from Mosul, there were actually hundreds of thousands of people who had already left. So these kind of impositions of borders, if only they were a solution for peace and stability. In fact, they generate, even if they were temporarily stable, they generate more instability in the future because you have displacement, because you have governments which come in and deny the basic rights of the population as this Islamic State is happening. And so they generate within them the seeds of their own undoing in many ways, or the seeds of their own restlessness. It is logical to a certain extent that you have in the Middle East a conservative, rather, overall a religious population who might want a government which represents this religiosity. So what we're dealing with the Islamic State is very different than movements like the Muslim Brotherhood, who are religious, conservative movements, who are an authentic expression of that society. We're dealing with extremist groups that are largely rejected by society, that have methods of control and social policy that is unacceptable, I would say. Now, many people would challenge this, and in fact, people are saying that you don't know what the Middle East had become. Maybe Professor Ashik will say, no, in fact, many of the population does accept that. I don't think that's the case. I think, again, the problem is that you have, the Islamic State unilaterally created its borders. So nothing like that will actually pass and become accepted and become basically stable equilibrium that we could say, okay, at least they unified them.
Yeah, that's what I said, giving other considerations about Shakespeare. I was referring to the Ludwig's, the idea of homogenizing the population of the territories of the former Ottoman.
Yes, and in many ways this, you could say that there was some aspiration, the Arab Nationalist Project or other Syrian Nationalist Project, were aspirations to reunifying these territories. But as long as the process is not done through a process to some extent of a national consensus in those countries, it's going to fail, I think. In terms of the second question, I agree with you, and in fact, I mentioned that the Geneva One, let me step back. Even though there were allies of the regime and allies of the opposition, within the allies there was divergence, and within the adversaries there was convergence. So even though Russia and the US, and I would say the US and Israel, even though US and Israel were adversaries on Russia in the case of supporting or opposing Assad, they agreed on the need not to have regime collapse. On the other hand, there was divergence between the US and Saudi Arabia. So the allies diverged and the adversaries converged to some extent. And this is why the issue is even more complex than the traditional exposition of it's the US, Israel, and the Europe and the Gulf against Russia and China and so forth. And this divergence was reflected in the Geneva Agreement, which was done without the consultation of Saudi Arabia and Qatar. It was forced on them. In fact, Geneva II, the Syrian political opposition was forced by the US to go to Geneva II against the wishes of Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And I would say a big part of why the US pushed for this was through, because Israel did not want to see a collapse of the regime. Now we have no way of knowing, they didn't declare this publicly, but it's hard to come to any other conclusion that the Assad regime is, as they say, the devil you know versus the devil you don't know. And in fact, from the perspective of Israel, despite the fact that there were official hostilities at the verbal level and the public level, and in many ways Syria had alliances that the US did not like, but the Syrian regime was very pragmatic, and in fact, as they say, the Syrian-Israeli front was the quietest front in terms of the Arab-Israeli crisis in the last 30, 40 years. So it's very much, now they may not like Assad, but I think what the US wanted was Assadism without Assad, basically. Whereas Russia wanted Assadism with Assad. That's the basic difference between them.
Sí. Thank you very much for your time and clear explanation. For people like me who are not deeply involved in this kind of issue, it's very important to receive different point of view in a very academic way. My question is related to a book I read some time ago. I believe the title of the book is God but Not God. It's an explanation about the Islamism. And in the thesis of the book is that what we are living in the Middle East, not only in the Middle East, in the Islamic world, is a religion world. It's a war between the different functions of the interpretation of the Quran. It put the idea that it's similar to what we were living in Christianity in the 17th century during the 30-Year War. After this war, we started with the possibility of a different interpretation of Christianity to live together. Do you think that it is possible to interpret this conflict in the Islamic world in this way?
Before you answer, Embajador Friedman, por favor.
Thank you very much for the history review, because we make a review of almost 50 years, 60 years of work. I'm confused about the result of this conference, because we started saying that the Palestinian issue, Palestinian Israeli issue, was probably the most important in the region. And we are ending up saying that the Sunni Shia is the most important issue at this moment. So my question is, if this is, if this is what is real, that the Arabs have a problem, and they don't solve the problem, are they using now again the Palestinian Israeli issue as an excuse for solving their problems, as they did in 1948 and 1967, when they were trying to rally the Arab population under the banner of the nationalism? Because trying to promote nationalism, they use the Israeli-Palestinian problem. And now they are using again the Israeli-Palestinian issue as a way of rallying. But in reality, we have another deeper issue in the Arab world. And because of that, you don't make any reference to the influence of the revolution in Egypt, when Morsi progress on the Hamas movement and the breaking up of the Hamas Fatah in 2000, 2001, 2002, and finally, I mean, they are now again together. I mean, so the Israeli issue, the Israeli Palestinian issue seems to be an accident at this moment.
Por favor, le pasa al señor y la última pregunta. Acá.
Do you think that in the future, if the ISIS gain more power and more influence, it will consider an offensive on Israel? Because I don't understand how now the group that is a Sunni group is fighting secular and Shiites, while the Israel army is killing Palestinian Sunnis. But maybe the group is not interested in the area of Israel because it don't have the natural resources that Syria and Iraq have, or maybe the great powers, the US, the European Union, or the Gulf monarchies have some influence on the group to avoid that attack the ally Israel.
Thank you. I'll try to answer them in tandem because they're similar to the last two questions, especially, and the issue of the religious war. Let me start with the issue of the religious war. I guess my views on that, very briefly, are that there are many people in the Middle East taking up arms and fighting, and in their minds they are fighting the religious war. So from that sense, it can't be denied that there are lots and lots of people who are engaged in violent confrontation for religious reasons, in a sense. And I think the best example of this is the Syrian civil war, where you've seen Sunni jihadi groups, and also you've seen Shia groups coming from Iraq, for example. The Shia groups coming from Iraq, they're not fighting for Assad because they care about Assad. He's become a symbol to a certain extent, rather than an actual support for his government. And I guess part of the fight, part of the struggle in the Middle East is between those who want to fight the religious war and those who are against the idea that there is a religious war and that there should be a religious war. And I, even though I mentioned that there are political reasons initially for instrumentalizing religion for political ends, but this has now become taking on a life of its own. These are actors who are not simply tools. Many of them have independent agency. That's even scarier than if they were just proxies, because if they were proxies, you can pressure their supporters to stop supporting them. Now it's become even, they become more independent in a sense. So I guess these are my thoughts on that, and I guess we'll see in the coming years what happens. In terms of Israel and Palestine, part of what I was referring to is that, in fact, they're not using Palestine as a diversion. In fact, most Arab states have abandoned the Palestinians. There is no more Arab, and yes, in the past, many of them, I agree with you, they would use the Palestinian issue to divert attention from their own dictatorships, from their own corruption and so forth. But that's not even the case, because most of the Arab states have abandoned the Palestinians, provide them with very little support. And it's no longer an issue that they at least verbally commit to, even when they used to verbally commit to it. So the only rallying towards the Palestinians that you see comes from mainly a popular level, mainly a level of the people-to-people solidarity, because they can't stand to see the massacres being committed. So I would say that while the Palestinian issue was in fact used previously by the Arab governments for their own purposes, that's no longer the case. I think it's the case increasingly, and if you travel through the region and you see, for example, Palestinian refugees. I was just in Lebanon last month. I was in June in Lebanon, and we have now in the Middle East three large refugee populations, Palestinian, Syrian, and Iraqi. And by far, the treatment of the Palestinian refugees is the worst by the Arab governments. Right? It's not just the issue of Israel. And so I think it's, you have multiple conflicts. It's not just the Palestinian. I mentioned that the Palestinian issue was traditionally the issue that we thought of as the big problem, but that now it exists alongside other conflicts. I didn't intend to say that it was still the main or the only one, and I think it's still important, but it exists alongside others. In terms of would the Islamic State fight Israel, certainly what we've seen from these groups, and I'm talking about what you're usually referred to as these extremist jihadi takfiri groups, which are rather fringe and they're Al-Qaeda type groups, let's say, is they have not explicitly taken up the fight against Israel as one of their main issues. They have in Iraq fought the US occupation, but they seem to be more interested in what they call cleansing the Muslim world from apostasy, from imposing their own version of rule over the areas that they control. Now, certainly I think Israel is against having them anywhere close to Israel because it's possible that they would fight Israel. And this Islamic State is very new, it's just 2 months old, so we don't even know if it will exist by the end of the year or 2 years, although indications are that it may. So it's too early to tell, and it's possible that similar groups might become a threat to Israel at this point. But these groups have not, in fact, shown a tendency that they are heading to fight Israel.
Bueno, muchas gracias, profesor. Creo que hemos tenido una sesión muy completa y les agradezco personalmente y en nombre del profesor y del Cari, no solo la presencia, sino la intervención y las preguntas que han hecho, que han complementado muy bien la exposición original del profesor Dahi. Yo creo que ha sido muy fructífero y ahora, después de las preguntas, me voy un poco menos pesimista que antes. Espero verlo la próxima vez.